It is my pleasure today to introduce Pamela Ramnarain, who will be sharing her journey from being an early adopter to Agile within HR in 2015 to embrace the Agile practice by leaving HR for a time to become an Agile coach. Since then, she has now returned to HR as a senior manager and HR business partner at Scotiabank, where she continues to leverage her combined Agile and HR experience to support senior business leaders with driving strategic talent management, employee engagement, and cultural change within the teams she supports. And over to you.
Thank you very much for the intro, Noah and Noelle, sorry. And I'm really excited to be here to have this talk today. And again, if you have any questions at the end, looking forward to it. So my journey begins in 2014, when I was a project manager at the organization that I was working at. And my goal there was to help with the launch of our second phase of the software studio and support with the marketing perspective and the recruiting team's perspective in partnership with learning and communications in the business. And, you know, I took it when I started as from a project manager point of view, and the goal was to really help them continue to progress the software studio. The business was concerned because our process was pretty rigorous, and they thought that there were delays with our hiring process due to our sourcing. So as a project manager, it was my goal to really help understand what this issue might be and how we can mitigate that. And because I was a visual person, I always wrote everything down on a piece of paper, and I always had a scrap paper with me, and I would visualize like the work I did, or even the process, the recruitment process, which I knew was pretty rigorous at our organization, but thorough. And one day I was sitting at my desk, and one of the Agile coaches walked by. I think it was, you know, he was doing his gumbo walk, and he stopped to chat with me, and he asked me a couple of questions. And some of the questions were aligned to, you know, why is this important to you? What problem are you trying to solve for? And I explained to him the dilemma that I was in. And he said to me, Pamela, the best thing to do is start where you are. So just showcase your work. And so I procured a visual management board, not a big one. This is not the board, but a similar one. And I started to showcase the recruitment process that we had in play. And then with the team support that I was working with, we showcased the marketing as well as the learning and communication. So we could kind of see what was happening. And that was my intro to the Kanban board. But what ended up happening was, as we were working through it, one day the same Agile coach left me some sticky notes and a Sharpie, because he saw that I was using my marker on the whiteboard to just write down everything. And so during my conversations with the team, my daily huddles, I would just literally pick it up and start writing and sticking things on the board without consciously being aware of what I was doing. And one day the lean coach, she walked by and she said to me, Pamela, like, are you tracking the cycle times and looking at the SLAs for each part of the recruitment process? And I said, no, that might be a great opportunity point for us. So then we started tracking that. And what ended up happening was, one day we had a huddle and we stepped back, the HR business partner and I, and we looked at the board and we saw a bottleneck of sticky notes right in the interview stage, but not moving past interview to offer. And we're like, what's going on here? So then we talked to the recruiting team and they said, Pamela, we have a ton of people that went through interview. Our SLA is 3 days, but it was taking over a week to get a response. So, you know what we did? We actually cleared the whiteboard on that section, extended it out, and started to track where the candidate had started and where, if they're going through first interview, second interview, and then when they were moved to decisioning. And what we found was there was a bottleneck happening at the decisioning point where we needed to have a conversation with the business. So we had the conversation with the business, but at the same time, we leveraged the board to actually fine-tune some of our sourcing processes. And also from a marketing standpoint, when we saw that perhaps we had a good pipeline of talent for developer type roles, then the marketing switched to areas where we didn't have a good pipeline of talent, which was DevOps or something else. And so at the end of the day, what ended up happening was This Kanban board, which started as something so small, grew into something very massive and gave us the opportunity to really key in on more transparent communication between us and the business and start to form that partnership and understand our customer. It allowed us to really look at our time to fill and bring that down very quickly, as well continue to hire high potential candidates. But what but what I would say is the biggest part of it was um, also the practices. It changed the way that we looked at our recruiting practices and how we implemented that. And it also allowed us to save on our brand and marketing because we targeted where we went to recruit for roles. And personally, I used the Kanban board at home. It helped me stay organized as a working mom, and also made me reduce my stress level because I would be able to see what I could control in the process and what I couldn't, and just add more clarity to my day. So, that was my first intro into the visual management board. And I want to also say from the customer perspective, so our client, what happened was after we had that conversation with them, we started to make decisions much faster around decisioning, going back to their concerns about us, having a lag time with regards to sourcing talent. And we allowed them to focus on the final stage of the value proposition to the candidate. So it was more along the lines of, why should you come work for this organization, as opposed to decisioning? So they spent more time interacting with that candidate and bringing them on from a marketing perspective. So that was a big win for us. Naturally, that role, it came to an end in 2016. The organization was going through a lot of change, and HR was also going through a lot of change. Agile was becoming a more known within the organization, and we started to see a more focused approach on the customer. And so HR itself, our leader, left. We had a new leader from the US coming up to run the team. And we had some problems in HR. Our engagement score was very low and morale of the team was very low. And so I was asked to take on this new position. And it was a chief of staff, manager of analytics, and agile coach. It was a 3-in-1. And so, I took it on, and the first two I kind of figured I understood and I had done before, but the agile coach one I needed support with. And I turned to the agile coaching team, and they supported me through that. And we knew that in order to really shift, to get the strategy that we wanted to implement, we had to work on the culture first, because we knew that if the employees and the leadership team that was there was not engaged and they didn't believe in what the VP was trying to implement, it wouldn't be successful. Culture eats strategy for breakfast, lunch, dinner, everything. So what I did was I leveraged my 3 roles. So as a chief of staff, I took it from the perspective of the opportunity to work very closely with the HR leadership team and understand, what were their challenges, how were they getting through that change curve, how could I support them, and observe their behaviors, leverage the HR analytics part of it to understand what it was from the survey that we were lacking. And then from the Agile standpoint, we leverage the Agile values and principles to really bring the VP's vision, mission, goals, principles, and values to life. The Agile the values became part of what our values were. We changed the wording a bit, but it became part of that. The principles we weaved into everything that we did. And some of the examples of that was, we had it visually all over the office. We had a campaign around, what the values were, why they were important, the principles behind that. We intertwined it into our town halls, and we also gave employees the opportunity to share their personal stories of how they were living the values. And so it allowed the team, which was struggling a lot with communication, with trust, it gave them an opportunity to really come together and connect. And so what ended up happening, the HR leaders were not only also living the values, but living the behaviors. It also raised our engagement score from 56% to 82% in a very short period of time. It also had the reinforcement of the leaders because they would actually reinforce the messaging down. And we saw a lot more connectivity, collaboration, transparency, and we started to see the agile practices starting to emerge. So what was next? Well, we wanted to focus on the customer. And in 2017, I was approached to come work for the business as an Agile coach. It was a great opportunity. It would give me a chance to leave behind the 3 hats and focus on something that I was very interested in. And it was changing my whole perspective on how I saw things. I also understood that the HR team had built this culture, which is still very vulnerable. And we needed to now implement that strategy to follow behind it and carry through to the customer experience that they wanted to create. And so for me, it was an opportunity to now be able to fully support them on that strategy side and that implementation side without having to carry the other 2 hats. So I went to work with some of the best Agile lean coaches I know in the business, and they helped me see things from a different perspective. I helped the HR team build out their strategy with a focus on layering in the business and organizational strategies, but also how they communicate that message to their team and the transparency and making sure it was meaningful. We also focused on building the KPIs that had value behind them. And it wasn't about the output, it was about the outcome and what we were really trying to drive towards from a customer perspective. So what ended up happening was we also ended up building, once the strategy was implemented, there was some key initiatives that really linked to that HR strategy that would link back to the customer. And so what I did was I helped them build their pod. And we built several of them, and it was focused around the practices of Agile, in addition to other things the team was working on. But it allowed us to build these cross-functional teams within HR with people that brought different, skills and experiences to the table to work on these key initiatives that supported HR's overall objectives and values, and we integrated the purpose around that. So what they were working on, their team norms and expectations. It was really funny because the visual management, at one point they went competition on who would create the best visual management for what they needed. And it was fun. They made it a fun experience. And they started to understand, what was work in progress, what was limiting your work in progress about. They started to understand the importance of KPIs and the outcomes as opposed to outputs, and the incremental value in learning. So one of the things was, as in projects, there was always typically a start and an end, and that was it. And you just worked through that project and it didn't matter what the customer thought. But now the team was starting to think more about the customer experience and getting feedback from the customer and releasing short project initiatives that they could actually get the feedback and iterate on. And that was the important part of it. And the retrospectives was a different layer. So it allowed them to really understand where their teammates were coming from, especially if there were any concerns that they needed to address. It was great. So at the end of the day, it was challenging at times, and it was a journey, and it was a journey that I fully respected and learned a lot from. And so it gave the team a renewed focus on the customer, and learning and adapting and being open and understanding their teammates and the empowerment that comes with that as well. So where do I go from there? So now, in 2018, near the end of my mat leave, I was wrapping up a project where we had worked with the design thinking team, and it was really nice because we collaborated with them, and then we were bringing in the Agile practices. And now I was coming into my mat leave, and I realized on my mat leave that there was more that I could bring to HR, and I could bring it from a different perspective. And so what I did was I took the opportunity to start thinking about what it was I wanted next in my career. And what Agile did for me was it reconfirmed that I really enjoy coaching and facilitating and mentoring and putting on that consultant hat as well. But I wanted to do it in HR as an HR business partner, because that's where we actually have the opportunity to bring everything together and really influence and work with the business. And so I decided to take a chance to move in, to pursue that opportunity. And it was great, because what I do now is I walk into situations with that coach perspective, and I'll switch as I need to. But I also walk in with a learner's mindset. It's something that I come from a place of curiosity when I'm asking questions. And I'm always asking, what are we trying to solve for here? What outcomes are we trying to drive? Even if I don't tell the leader right up front what I'm thinking, these are the things I'm thinking about, and what value is it going to be to their employees and to who we're supporting. I really do appreciate the small incremental wins now. I never thought I would before, but I do. It's those small nuggets, especially when you're coaching, when you see the opportunity and you move in and you start working with the leader, and then you actually see it come in the bigger wins. That's very rewarding. And then the self-reflection piece is all utmost important. As a coach, and even you're constantly supporting other people, and it's important to self-reflect, and it gives you new perspective and new viewpoint. And I'm always welcome to feedback and new approaches. And then change is a big underlining one that really came out in my Agile experience. It was so important to help individuals through change and helping to change that behavior. But it takes meeting them where they are and then working with them through that. And that's what I do now every day. I'm constantly working with teams going through change and constantly helping them in whatever facet that might be. So for me, this has been a phenomenal experience. It's changed my perspective on how I work, the way I work, the way I interact with my leaders, and the way I think. And it's made me very much willing to be open to new ideas and perspectives, and be okay with pivoting and changing as required. So I hope that you learned something, or at least you had. Thank you for the opportunity, and I hope that there's some questions that I can answer for you. But I want to thank AgileTO for providing me with this opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Pam, that was incredible. What a huge amount of information you covered in a very short time frame. I don't know. I know you can't see them all, because a lot of people have sent me questions privately. A few have posted them publicly as well. I suspect we're going to be here for a little while, and we'll do our best to get through all of these. These are some fantastic questions, but if anyone does have any questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat window. And we will do our best to get through as many of these as we can. I'm going to try and group some in a couple of ways. So some of you have asked similar questions of me, or of Pam, actually, not of me. But Pam, before we do, you said something right off the bat that I wanted to jump into. There were a couple of people who wanted a little more information. You talked about something called a Gemba walk. What is that?
Yeah. Yeah, so Gumbo walk is when you actually walk around. You literally walk around and find out, it's even just talking to your employees, but find out what your employees are doing. It's literally just having a conversation. And what we used to do was, our leaders, especially when we were doing the engagement change for culture, we would walk around and ask our employees, how are you doing today? And what are you working on? Can you show me what this is on the board? Can you explain to me a little bit more what that means? And it was just probing questions that you would ask, and you would get a better understanding of the work they were doing without it formally being out there. But it also gave you a chance to have a conversation with the employee. We don't do that where I am now, but what I do is, when I'm talking to a leader or a director or VP, whoever, I'll be like, so what's your team working on? Tell me a little bit more about it. And if I have an opportunity to attend their meetings, I try to ask a little bit more about the work and understand what outcomes they're trying to drive. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, no, totally. It sounds like it was very much tied into the visual management that was
Yes.
being done, so that you could actually visualize sort of this intangible work that many of us do in a software and a knowledge work type of environment.
Yes, it was. And the funny part was because we had visualized the work and it just drew people to the board. So you'd be working away and you would just be standing there and someone would be up behind you asking you a question. So the lean coach, he walked up to me, agile coach walked up to me, and they would just have conversations and they would look at the board and be like, you guys are really working on all those things. And they'd be like, what's that bottleneck? And wow, you reduced that service level time. Like, what was that about? Tell me more. And it just was an opportunity to share the things that normally you wouldn't share in an executive report.
Really cool. Yeah, things get hidden by that red, yellow, and green ball that we report.
Yeah,
There's a couple of questions that have come in around the fact that you were doing this with recruiting. And that in an HR environment, it's often confidential information of people's names that you're putting up on there. So there are two questions that have come out of this. One is, how did you deal with the confidential nature of the information that you were putting? And number two, you touched on the fact that it helped you with your diversity in hiring. Can you maybe talk a little bit about how it helped with the diversity and how it helped or how you kept confidential information from being publicly displayed?
Sure. Yeah, very good question. So we went right to our risk and compliance person to ask her, how could we do this confidentially? So we used initials because we had a lot of referrals coming in on the as well. So instead of putting faces or names, we just used initials, and we actually had a spreadsheet. It's a little bit more work, but we had a spreadsheet with the names, so we knew exactly who it was. And with regards to diversity, so it was what we did was we would just highlight with a different color, and we just put a little note. You know, we had the same post-it notes, but we would just highlight, like if it was a woman, in a different color. And it was just for us, confidentially, for us to know if that person was coming through the process.
Really cool. You talked also about the idea of cross-functional teams, and a few people have asked, can you talk a little bit more about what do you mean by a cross-functional team in HR? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so our HR team in Canada comprised of benefits, payroll, learning, recruiting, everything, HR business partners, so multiple areas within HR. And every one of those teams are working in silos as opposed to working as cross-functional teams. So a lot of the key initiatives from a strategic perspective that we were implementing required the support of all of these teams. So what we did was we asked people to volunteer from each of these areas to join these project teams, which were our pod teams, and join with the opportunity to not only share their knowledge, but to learn from their peers. And there was a lot of cross-learning that was happening in these pod structures. So our team was made up of, you know, the full HR department, but they were all just working on their individual projects and not seeing the opportunity to work together.
Really cool. So these were full-time people that were working.
Yes.
Really neat. When you talk about the evolution of bringing these cross-functional groups together, what was the time frame that it took for the group of individuals to come together and start working as an agile group, as opposed to these independent silos that they were in previously?
Yeah.
What was the time frame?
So it was, it wasn't that long. It was short because we had already started the cultural journey, right, with them. We got lucky. I mean, you don't always have the opportunity to impact culture, right? We get it. And so, and when you're bringing in strategy, a lot of times you're dealing with the existing culture and trying to deal with that. So we were already impacting the culture. So it only took us a few weeks actually to bring these teams together and then get them functioning, because we had already started the journey of them working cohesively as one team. And we already had the practices in play in the background. So we were already kind of doing daily huddles. We were doing a little bit of visual management. So now it was bringing it more formally together and then having them form their purpose. So just sitting there and being a facilitator to help them determine, you know, what is the purpose? They had the strategy. So now they had to drive towards what it was they really could actually do.
Did you encounter any sort of resistance from any of the people?
Of course, yes. We encountered it through the cultural change. So some of our leaders going through the change in, leadership, their own change curve. We encountered it there. And for the most part, you can only help them on that journey and help understand where they are on that change curve and how you can help inform them or bring them along on that journey. So we encountered it through the culture change, and we also encountered it in the pods. And so what we would do is use the retrospective as an opportunity point to try to understand a little bit better. I also worked one-on-one a lot with the teammates. I would have sit downs with them and just, talk to me over coffee, tell me what's going on as a coach, and try to help them individually through that journey, but also as a team where we saw there was an opportunity point. So yes, it's never, all roses. You're going to have challenges. And that's what I enjoyed about coaching as well, because you actually got to work with individuals and teams and help them through that.
Cool. Listen, there are like a dozen more questions and they're good, so I'm going to keep going. But if some of you have to drop off, given that it is 6:30, there is a link in the chat window to a survey, a feedback survey, and the organizing group would love to hear your feedback. So if you have to drop off, please feel free to drop off. Hopefully you can stay and hear the rest of what Pam has to say, or you can check it out later on the YouTube channel. But either way, please take a minute to fill out the feedback form. But Pam, if you're good, I'm going to keep going with these questions because they're great.
Yeah.
Awesome. We were just talking about the idea of resistors and people who took a little bit of time to get going here. And you touched on how important it was to engage in people with individuals through those interactions that you had with them. And I'm reminded that those words, individuals and interactions, are part of an Agile manifesto that was written almost 20 years ago. In fact, February will be 20 years. How did you translate the words from the Agile manifesto and those values and principles into non-technology words that other people, because it's clearly the Agile manifesto for software delivery. How did you translate that into an HR and a business context?
Yeah. Yeah, we used it as our baseline, but it was more of collaboration, focusing on your customer, interaction, trust, teamwork. Like that was the approach we took from a competency standpoint and how we could help you. And so I love that part of the individual, like connecting with the individual, because there's a tendency to not connect, right? And there's a tendency to walk away. And so when you're able to connect with someone and get to know them a little better, then you understand that there's more to what they have to say. And maybe there's a concern that they're having that you haven't been able to address. So when you're able to peel back the layers, you learn more about them, and then you can help them on that journey. So we would use it from not the technology terms, but we would use it from the competencies, the behaviors, the human factors perspective.
That's really cool. Funny enough, I happened to, through some friends, get some information from the people who wrote the Agile Manifesto. And looking back, there's one word they wish they changed, and that's that working software over comprehensive documentation. They wish they'd changed to delivered products, not projects, delivered products over comprehensive documentation. And I think that kind of goes, Pam, to what you're talking about here. It's about embracing what's going behind it. That's really, really cool. Okay. I'm going to move on to some other questions. Can you talk a little bit about the change that you've had personally about this? You kind of touched on it at the end, but maybe could you dig in a little bit more about how your experience in coaching teams and working with these lean and agile coaches, some of whom you say were the best you've ever worked with in your career, how did they change you as an individual?
Oh, the list can go on and on, but I think the one big thing was moving to a learner's mindset, being open to constantly learning, asking questions from a place of curiosity, and wanting to be engaged in the conversation and being an active listener. I think that was one of the biggest things I took away from that team. I learned so much, but that was probably one of the biggest things, is that learning mindset and really coming from a place of curiosity and wanting to truly understand what the problem was. Now, we always know that it's very hard to get to the root of the problem, and you may only get to the symptoms, but if you can help yourself or someone on that journey, it just makes it so much better. So I've taken so much away, but I think that was one of the biggest things. And I constantly remember all the questions, like, why are we doing this? You know, what outcomes are we trying to drive? You know, what problem are we trying to solve for? And I take that with me throughout my practice now. And I don't always say it to leaders, but I have it in the back of my mind because I'm constantly thinking, is this valuable to them? If this is not valuable to them, then why are we doing it?
Really cool. Okay, let's turn it around. That was a little bit about you. How about some of the other HR professionals that you've worked with? How has your change in thinking influenced those your peers, your colleagues on those teams?
So the ones I worked with, for them, it was, for some, it was intrinsically thinking about, you know, what value they bring and the work that they do, and does it really measure up? Like, when are you producing a ton of things that are not actually adding value, or are you actually driving towards the outcome that you were really trying to do and achieve? And I think the other part of it was the ability to coach them, but not in a way that it felt like they were being coached, that it was more of a conversation, and it was more of an opportunity to grow and learn and really tap into their emotional intelligence side. So I think, you know, if you talk to people I've worked with before, they said Pamela's very much, she's an active listener, and she helped us become that as well, and helped us see the value in, you know, why it's important to build KPIs that make sense, that we can actually attribute to the work we do, and it attributes back to the value of what we're trying to drive for the business, or the ability, the importance of having those conversations, those difficult conversations, and getting to the root of the problem and trying to come to a resolution that's better. So I think that would be some of the things they would say.
Really cool. There are a couple of questions in here talking about how you measured the impact of the change. Now, someone's asked the question, how did you measure how agile the people were and the teams were? I'm wondering, did you measure how agile the people and the teams were, or were you more focused on the outcomes that those people were producing?
It was more focused on the outcomes and their behavioral change. So it was more focused on their engagement. So we would actually check in with the team to see, like, how are you feeling? We did, like, one of the things I didn't mention in when I was talking about culture was we did a lot of work around, we did surveys, so anonymous surveys, but we also did like high five surveys, like, are you feeling good today? Are you not feeling good? So for us, it was more of the measurement of how was their morale, and how were they feeling? And then, yes, how were they driving towards the outcome? But that's how we measured it. And it was done through team health checks. We also did team health checks. And the team actually came up with, you know, what was it that they want to measure on the team health check? And they would, and that was the point of it, was to empower them. It wasn't about me, it was about them. So that's how we measured it. It was never at the forefront. It was always in the background, because the minute you try to bring it to the forefront for a corporate function, they just go, no thanks. But if you're able to embed it in what they're already doing, they value it a lot more.
Interesting. All right. You know what? Tied into that a little bit, someone's asked, actually, a couple of people have asked for additional examples. You mentioned about recruiting. Were there other places in HR that you were able to do this? And in the interest of time, you know, maybe a brief answer here so we can get to a couple of the other questions.
Sure.
But was it done in more areas of HR than just recruiting?
Yes, I also worked with compliance. I worked with our compliance team as well. I worked with our payroll team. I worked with our learning team. I worked with multiple teams in HR.
Cool. What's changed? A lot of what you've talked about is the individuals and interactions, going on Gemba walks and going to where the work happens to see that, which, as someone rightly points out, isn't an agile practice. It comes out of lean, but an incredibly, incredibly powerful tool, it sounds like, that you were able to make great use of. How has that changed in the last 8 months as we've been working in a virtual environment where you can't go and walk by a Teams board?
Yeah. So I think I mentioned earlier is it's the conversations that I have, because the teams I work with, a lot of them, they don't have visual management boards. Nobody has visual management boards now. It's all online, or it's through conversations. And so it's the conversations that I have with them. And I look at it from the perspective when I'm working with the leaders, I talk to them about the behavioral shift with their team. I talk about, the mindset shift that they're going through, the change that they're seeing in their team with the work that we're doing, as opposed to, something like a Gemba walk, which does come from lean. And that's probably because I dabbled in both and had the exposure to both, which is fine because I love it. I love having the toolkit of multiple approaches to be able to work with.
It's interesting that you talk about that. And I think when you talk about, and I mean, it resonates when you talk about working with great Agile coaches, because they'll pull from anywhere that makes sense. There's great stuff that comes out of PMBOK. There's great stuff that comes out of Lean. And it sounds like you were able to bring all of that together to help solve a real business problem for a real business customer at the right time.
Yes, and still doing it. It's part of the toolkit, right? And that's the beauty of it when you get exposure, is having this in your toolkit.
When you look back, this journey started for you, 5 years ago, roughly. When you look back, what do you wish you knew 5 years ago that you know today? What would you tell your younger self?
Yeah, I would tell my younger self to just be okay with the journey. It's a journey. And, sometimes it didn't always make sense, and I didn't really understand a lot, not a lot, but some of it that was happening. But now when I look back, it makes perfect sense. It makes, I still remember things that I learned and I still apply it. So just go along with the journey and be fine with it. Don't force it. Just go along with it.
You were very lucky, Pam, or maybe it was maybe it wasn't luck. Maybe it was, it wasn't, it wasn't a good thing. I don't know. How did having domain knowledge help you or hinder you when it came time to focusing on the process and helping the teams out? You mentioned you had a background in HR and you were very comfortable helping those teams, but then you went and helped compliance teams and finance teams and legal teams. Did having the domain knowledge, did it drag you into getting focused on what they were doing as opposed to how they were doing it? Or were you able to keep those two apart? I'm just curious.
Yeah. And I think, yeah, it's a really great question. I think when I started working with other teams, it allowed me to really step away from the what and focus on the how a lot more. And legal, I didn't have a background in legal. Risk, I didn't have a background with them, but it was more focusing on what the how they were going about it. And it wasn't so much about the product. It was like, how is this team functioning? What are the areas of opportunities? And they would tell me about legal stuff. I said, no, I want to talk about you and your team. Let's talk about that. And the products will be there and will help you on that, but I want to talk about the team. So it was great to step out of that and work on with other teams on the how.
Pam, it sounds like you've got a ton of experience for this, and I imagine that there are a million other questions. I think I tried to get to pretty much all of them. I think I checked off every box, although I did reword a bunch to sort of group 3 or 4 questions into one because they were so good tonight. But if people wanted to follow up with you, what's the best way for people to get in touch with you?
Yep. So I am on LinkedIn, so you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on there, and be happy to connect with anyone. Just let me know that you attended AgileTO and be happy to connect with you and have further conversations.
That was really awesome, Pam. Loved hearing the story. Thank you so much for sharing it. Just a reminder, everyone, as we wrap this up, there is a link in the chat window. Please provide your feedback. We love to know what we did well as what we could do better or differently. And Pamela, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us tonight.
Thank you, everyone.